So, Social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is the application of principles of Darwinian evolution to human races with the drawing of social and political conclusions. So, Darwinian evolution is natural selection, right? So this is the idea, the basic idea underlying evolution by natural selection is that you've got animals that are living within the same ecosphere, same environment, and there's competition over resources within that environment. And so in an environment of scarce resources, when you have different kinds of animals that are competing, the animals that are better physically equipped to survive are the ones that do survive. And the corollary of that is that if you have a species of animal that has a broad range of physical manifestations within it, within a particular environment, and some form of greater scarcity emerges, like bad weather comes, or there is some other animal that moves into the area that it begins to compete, then only those members of the species within that particular, with that particular physical trait are going to survive. Or at the very least, that they're going to have a greater likelihood of surviving, right? So the classic question, why do giraffes have long necks? Well, presumably at some point in the distant past, there were giraffes with, were something that the predecessor of a giraffe that had a range of neck lengths, but that coming into an environment where the best resources available were leaves on trees, you just stood a better chance of surviving if your neck was long. Therefore, you've got long necks now. Last thing to know about Darwinian evolution and what he's talking about when he's talking about origin of species is that he said when you begin with the same animal, but then some group within that whole animal's population begins to deviate from the rest, then once it has deviated a particularly large amount, you can consider that to be a new species rather than the original species from which it deviated. And he said basically that we could identify that because then the offspring between that particular new species and the previous species would not be fertile if they could reproduce at all. That was sort of the marker that lets you know that speciation, as he called it, had occurred. And so I mentioned this in class before, but this is something. This is a scientific idea that everything that we've learned about science since then has borne out, basically. So the question then arises: well, can we apply the principles of Darwinian evolution to human beings? And the answer is, well, yes and no. We know, for instance, that skin color, for instance, is determined by the amount of direct sunlight that populations were exposed to. If you were closer to the equator, then you were much more likely to get skin cancer and die unless your skin was significantly darker. If you were at the higher latitudes, way the hell up here, then you were going to do a lot better getting vitamin D from the sun if your skin was significantly lighter. And that's why human beings have different skin colors, basically, in a nutshell. What color were the original people? The best guess that we have is that the people that come from this part of Africa down here were called the Khoi people. That probably the original human beings looked a lot like they do, which is to say that something that probably a lot of non-Africans would identify as African. But even within Africa, there's a tremendous range of types of appearance. So yeah, evolution did have that particular, exerted that particular kind of influence on human populations. And also, by the way, the very same issue, it dictated the extent to which you were able as adults to digest milk, right? So pretty much the only people that are able as adults to digest milk are white people, because of the living up here with poor resources, poor availability of vitamin D. Most other people outside of Europe, the majority I should say, although there certainly are minorities that can digest milk, most can't, because vitamin D, as you might know from your study of science, is oil soluble and therefore toxic, right? So you can't get too much of it, so it was a way of being limited. So evolution produced those outcomes in us. But here's the thing, is that they didn't produce the inability of any two people taken from anywhere in the world to reproduce and have fertile offspring. And that's the way that we know that we never speciated. The other thing is that speciation usually takes a long, long, long time. And we only left Africa about 100,000 years ago. And it would take longer than that, significantly longer than that. So why do cultures differ? Because actually, before I jump back to that question, well, the bigger sort of consequence of this thinking comes out of colonialism, really, more than anything else. Because with colonialism, now Europeans, who are at the point when colonialism begins in the 15th century, are the most advanced technologically of all of the continents, now come into contact with significantly less technologically advanced civilizations. Right, so you've got Europeans coming into North and South America. The vast majority of these civilizations don't have written language. The vast majority of these civilizations don't have any kind of complex architecture. They don't have agriculture. They don't have division of labor. Therefore, they don't have any of these markers that Europe and Asia have had, and North Africa, for that matter, have had for several thousand years at this point. When the Europeans, when the English in particular, get to Australia in the 18th century, it's even worse than they have seen it in North and South America from the standpoint of technological advancement. They're still in the Stone Age, basically. They have only developed the most rudimentary tools. They can't work metal and all of that stuff. Africa has varying levels south of the Sahara of technological advancement, but it still is behind Europe and Asia, and even Asia is behind Europe to a certain extent. So when you want to apply the Darwinian principles of evolution to human beings as an explanation for everything, then one direction in which you are likely to move as a conclusion is that the reason that upon encountering Native Americans and Native Australians for the first time, they were so far behind Europeans and Asians in technological advancement was that they were just less smart. And that was an outgrowth of evolving separately from other human beings. Now, that's a simple explanation and therefore unlikely to be the correct one. I've mentioned this before, but I mean, there are a huge number of factors that determine why civilizations develop things like farming and writing for one thing, you don't even usually get writing without farming first. That farming basically is determined by what you have available to farm. The native Australians came into Australia 50,000 years ago into an extraordinarily resource-poor environment. And if it wasn't as poor as it was when Europeans got there in the 18th century, it got that way relatively quickly. Plus, you had the end of the Ice Age, which basically stranded them there for 50,000 years. So of course it's going to be less technologically advanced. If you have no contact, you have no good resources upon which to build a civilization, you're going to get what the native Australians had, period. Why did we have so much in Europe and Asia? Well, because we had extensive contact among cultures, for one thing. And we'd had it for a really long time. We had agriculture because we had an abundance of crops that could be domesticated, as well as an abundance of animals that could be domesticated, that could be moved along this longest line of latitude, and therefore could be kept at relatively the same climate. So if you needed to move for some reason, like a war or like scarcity in some place, you could bring your animals and you could probably bring your food too. And because we developed agriculture, we developed settled societies, and therefore we developed language and division of labor and all of those other things. And yeah, that had the result of us being more technologically advanced. But a significant proportion of that was luck. It was where we ended up. So, that kind of answers the first question second. And the second question is why isn't Darwinian evolution applicable to within the human race? Well, as I said before, it is and it isn't. Evolution has certainly determined some of our traits, but we have not speciated, as this should be abundantly clear. So, the last question is, well, what are the consequences of applying Darwinian thinking about the advancement of civilizations in particular, and its correlation, and this is vitally important, technological advancement and its correlation with the continent of origin of a people. So broadly speaking, again, Europe is the most advanced, Asia is second, Africa is kind of a mixed bag, the Americas are second to last, and Australia is last. So you can identify, roughly speaking, continental populations and rank them on the basis of their technological advancement. If you chalk that up to evolution, what are the consequences of that? Yeah.
The more developed people are just better than those developed.
There's going to come with that a significant sense of superiority. And to some extent, again, from a technological standpoint, that's going to be wholly justified. It's not something that's in question that the Europeans, upon encountering Native Americans, were technologically more advanced. They just plain were. It's an objectively measurable thing. But what will follow from that, from the assumption that their lack of advancement was based on their territorial ancestry, was that they couldn't become as advanced. That this division, for better or for worse, was a pure expression of biology. And as such, it meant two things. First of all, it meant that you could rank the races, because all race essentially is, when you get right down to it, is an expression of where, on which continent a person's ancestors came from. Well, that the races could be ranked on the basis of technological advancement, and that further they could be ranked, therefore, on the basis of their quality. So clearly the best people were going to be white people. Clearly the second best people were going to be East Asian people, Japanese, Korean, Chinese. And then everybody else was going to fall in, depending on people's basic way of viewing this question. We're going to fall in at some rate underneath that. And of course in East Asia they were going to view themselves as the best, and they were going to view whites as second best. And they were then, basically put everybody on a rank below that. And then people would put sub-Saharan Africans second to the bottom and Native Australians at the very bottom. And that they put sub-Saharan Africans very close to the bottom, by the way, said nothing about their actual assessment of the technological advances that they had in sub-Saharan Africa. It was essentially an assumption made on skin color, as well as the observation of some populations in sub-Saharan Africa being less advanced than others. But there were also populations in sub-Saharan Africa that were extraordinarily advanced. And so it lends itself to overgeneralization. It lends itself to presuppositions about the innate quality of individual human beings on the basis of where their ancestors came from. It led to, therefore, an assumption about, and this is the most important thing, if there were resources that became scarce, that conflict would emerge naturally, because that's the way nature is, and that the losing party would lose not because the winning party had been cruel or had done something wrong, but rather because the losing side had been inferior. And when this idea gets sort of solidified and weaponized in the form of an ideology that explicitly sort of proscribes something, or prescribes, I should say, something called race, then it becomes particularly toxic. Because the idea then becomes, well, if we go into a territory and the people there are not white, again, focusing here on European colonialism, because it is the factor that has the greatest impact with regard to this becoming a reality, then a whole series of assumptions will follow from that. They're not white, therefore they're less advanced than us, they're less smart than us, they can't be acculturated to the way that we do things. Therefore, if they die, that's not such a great big loss. Because there still is the recognition, by the way, that that human beings are still one population, even if it is stratified by race to some extent. And in a world where population is growing, but resources don't grow as quickly as population does, there's real anxiety about the extent to which a growing population will be sustainable with resources that don't grow as quickly. And so the sort of conclusion that's drawn out of that is that if these inferior populations die as a result of our superior population colonizing where they live, then that's a win for us, not only because we won't have them to compete with anymore, but also as a consequence of that, when resource scarcity comes, we'll be even better off. Scarcity will come much later for us if it comes at all, because we will have eliminated that part of our human population, regardless of race, that was weaker. So it feeds very much into an ideology called eugenics. Right? This is the idea that you can improve the quality of a human population by either focusing heavily on the positive characteristics of that population and incentivizing people with those characteristics to reproduce, or by taking people with negative characteristics and pulling them out of the gene pool, either by disincentivizing them in some way, or by preventing them from reproducing through sterilization or even just through killing them. Now, eugenics is, broadly speaking, something that we as human beings have been doing for a really long time. Right? We've been living with dogs for 35,000 years. And a dog is very different from a wolf. Right? You all can acknowledge that a dog is different from a wolf. Yes? Even though you're aware that they are members of the same species, they're actually just subspecies of the same species. Why are they different? They're different because they lived with us. And whether we did it consciously, which certainly we do now, or whether we did it almost accidentally, right? Like that wolf that is not as aggressive as his brothers and sisters will be the one that we will let come closer to the encampment. He'll get our food, therefore he has a better shot at surviving than his much less amenable and friendly brothers and sisters. I mean, think about what dogs do for us, right? Dogs are companions to us, they love us, and they eat anything that we give to them, which is precisely what they were designed to do, either deliberately or not. Now, that's eugenics. That's taking certain traits that are desirable in an animal, in a wolf, and only letting the members of that species with those characteristics reproduce. Do that enough, and boom, you're gonna get dogs and not wolves. Period. Now it so happens that we did it so much with dogs that we actually altered their DNA. We made dogs particularly elastic and able to evince changes quickly rather than slowly. So it only takes a couple of generations rather than like hundreds in dogs. But that again was the result of the fact that we've been with them for a really, really, really long time. So what's the difference between that and eugenics in human beings? Well, to some extent, I mean, if you go and, well, I'll give you a personal example. So I come from a mixed ethnic background, but I had one grandparent that was Jewish, and my wife is entirely Jewish, 100%. So when Jewish people get married, they have to be screened for a bunch of diseases that are more common in the Jewish population. This happens because Jews were conscribed to live within a single area of usually the city where they lived or the country in which they lived. But when you get generations of what's called endogamy, people marrying only within that same group, you get a much higher incidence of those traits that with one allele they're not particularly harmful, but with two they can be deadly. They're much more common in populations that have a very high level of intermarriage. So, but the test is very expensive, A, and B, I was at much lower risk because I was only a quarter ethnically from that population, whereas my wife was 100% from that population. So we gave her the test, and then whatever she was positive for, they tested me for. And that way it was significantly less expensive. Now, Jewish people get that test every single year. Anytime Jewish people get married or planning to have children, they get that test because the diseases that they could possibly come up with are instantly deadly for infants. And so making a conscious choice to, for instance, use in vitro fertilization and to not use embryos that have that particular gene set, that's a eugenic choice. But it's something very different when you then say, okay, well, we want to take this population of people, we being the people that are in charge in some way, take this population of people and say that if you have, some genetic disposition for some negative trait, say that you have the possibility of developing a mental illness later in your life, that you will forbid by law that person from being able to marry and have children, either by, again, disincentivizing them in some economic way, or literally just forbidding them to do it, either by force or by sterilization or by removing them from the population altogether. And that's what, it's not just what the Nazis did, by the way. I mean, this happened in countries all over the world in the early part of the 20th century. The Nazis just sort of, what the Nazis did was particularly unique because they went into other countries and did it with their populations, and they focused what they did on specific minorities within the populations that they occupied. In the United States, we just did it with people that we found to be intellectually feeble. And that might be, that they had Down syndrome, or it might be that they scored low on an IQ test, which we know today might just mean that they're a bad test taker. So this kind of thinking about genetic determinism and the idea that populations are the way that they are by virtue of their biology and no other influences, when taken to their extremes, can have really extremely negative consequences, and people can have their rights grossly violated based on these justifications. Which is why we talk about them side by side with racism. It is not merely a matter of racism being a belief in the superiority of one's own race over other races of people, or at the very least, a strong dislike of people not of one's race. More often than not, it's borne out very strongly by a sense of the inferiority of the other race, the race that is disliked. It's a minority of cases where racism is borne out by a suspicion that the other race is in some way better suited than you are. It happens, but it's not very often. And we know very, very well that the worst excesses in colonialism and imperialism are carried out on this basis. That where the population was sort of as from the standpoint of the colonizer, as racially different from the colonized as possible, the colonized suffered proportionally greater. So, that brings us to Herbert Spencer. Born in 1820 in northern England. He was self-educated but familiar with the works of Darwin and with Lamarck. Anybody ever heard of Lamarck, by the way? Lamarck? Lamarck was sort of the one of the most important competitors with Darwin. Lamarck believed that traits could be that acquired traits could be passed on to offspring. And for many years, it was thought that he was completely wrong. Thanks to a field of study called epigenetics, we now know that he was kind of half right. The genes have to be there in the first place, but if the environment is such that it causes those genes to be expressed, then they actually can be passed on to a subsequent generation. So Spencer, what sort of is, and he's the guy that coined the term survival of the fittest. And the reading that we have from him is from a book called Social Statics, and this is page 674 of your book. So what's important to understand about Spencer is that he is in this group of people who are, in 19th century England, like Mill, who are deeply influenced by Enlightenment thinking. So, remember, Enlightenment is this idea that, or these ideas, I should say, that emerge in Europe following the end of religious conflict. Right? Once it's decided in Northern and Western Europe that they don't want to fight about religion anymore, they usher in a long, peaceful period, relatively speaking, that gives rise to widespread scientific advance, as well as, more importantly for us, and the things we talk about in this class, the emergence of the idea of liberal democracy, right? This is Locke's idea that government is best when it's smallest, when it serves only its least responsibilities of protecting you and settling disputes. As well as, per Adam Smith, free market capitalism. As a corollary to the idea that government should do little or nothing other than protect you and settle disputes, it means that it should not regulate markets. Now, both Locke and Smith, who lived in the 17th and 18th centuries respectively, they both believed that the way that they respectively taught about politics and economics were things that would continue in sort of the forward drive of a humanity that the Enlightenment was giving rise to. Locke believed that humans could be freest in under a government that provided the greatest freedom by being smallest and getting the most out of people's way. And as you might recall, Smith believed that by allowing capitalism to flourish to the greatest possible extent, this would have unintended consequences of increasing the wealth of whole societies. So these are sort of the crowning political and economic achievements of the Enlightenment. And they are not, not insignificant, right? They have enormous impacts on things like quality of life and the availability of consumer products and all kinds of things like that. The question that arises as well, and this is sort of the other arm of the Enlightenment tradition in Western Europe in the 19th century, is what Marx talks about. That as this process is industrialized with capitalism, you get this creation of a class of people who are wage laborers, which means, remember, that they receive only the money that is required of them to buy their food and shelter and clothing. They have no disposable income, and therefore they can't afford things like better education, which is not being provided free of charge in England at that point. And therefore they are in a situation which means that they will not rise from their class. Their class status is permanent and intergenerational. But because quality of life has gone up and infant mortality has gone down, their numbers will get larger and larger. So you end up also having this, this thing that I made mention of before, but should probably concretize a little bit better. This notion arises in the 19th century, what's called the Malthusian crisis. This is the thing I was talking about before, that population grows exponentially, but food supply does not. Right, so if you've taken, I don't know what, probably you learned it in bio class, I would think I probably learned it in high school first, but populations grow at an exponential rate, right? You can do the rate thing with original population P times E to the RT power, right? And that's how populations grow over time. It's true for bacteria, and it's true for human beings, right? No matter what the life form is, it just basically tends to follow that particular curve, which goes like this, right? Gets quite steep later on, but then when it gets steep, it's really steep. Right? Food doesn't grow like that. Food grows like that. And so Malthus, this economist, says, okay, well, there's going to be this huge crisis, and ultimately we're going to reach a status of population that is going to mean we don't have enough food to feed everybody. So what are the consequences of that kind of thinking? And it turns out, by the way, he was wrong, because what he did not take into account was the industrialization of food production, which basically got rid of the problem. But assuming for the moment that that had not yet been taken into account and people believed that Malthus was right, what it means is that the only way to avert a true crisis, a catastrophic crisis for humanity, was to limit population growth. Now, this gave rise to, things like much more broad public support for birth control. Birth control was not newly created in the 19th century. People knew about it forever, had been practicing it forever, including abortion. But now, particularly to prevent people from seeking abortion, it becomes much more publicly acceptable for birth control to be more readily accessible to people, and to be taught about it, and for people to discuss it, like normal human beings, because it's not only bad for your family if you have 12 or 13 children, but it's bad for society at large, because resources are limited in their ability to feed huge families. Right? It made sense when it was a farming society and infant mortality was 50% that you were going to have a whole bunch of children. But once the problem of infant mortality is gotten rid of, it really is gotten rid of by and large in Europe and in the 19th century, then you need to cut back. And human beings being what they are, that requires birth control. So, the other side of that is eugenics. If we are only able to curtail, to a certain extent, population growth on the basis of advocating for things like birth control, then we also need to take into account limiting the extent to which people are able to reproduce at all. And the question that emerges now becomes this one, because you can look at it in an authoritarian society like China was until about 10 years ago. Until 10 years ago in China, it was against the law for people to have more than one child. They readily provided birth control in China, and they also provided abortion, and moreover, beyond that, they forced abortion in cases where women repeatedly became pregnant after one child, and then they will also confiscate the children and give them up for adoption. And this was the one-child policy. Now, it worked. It curbed their population growth, but it didn't take into account anybody's rights. So, in an authoritarian society, you can do things like that. Right? You can just make rules and say, okay, problem solved. We've got a problem with overpopulation. We're going to put down a one-child policy, and the problem will be solved. And by and large, it worked because, as I've said repeatedly in talking about societies like this, if you can throw enough human misery at a problem, you can usually solve it. But what do you do in a society that has been yielded by the ideas of Locke and Mill and Smith, of non-government intervention? The only thing that you can do is hope that Mill's marketplace of ideas kicks in, right? That the good idea of limiting family size becomes more broadly accepted by people. But what if it doesn't, right? What if Marx is right and capitalism has this effect of creating a larger and larger working class of people who will not rise out of their working class status? So first assume that's right, and then assume beyond that there are business cycles. There are booms and busts in economies, there are highs and lows, and that when an economy is in a recession, fewer jobs are going to be available, therefore obviously unemployment goes up, and now you've got families that are already on a wage laboring status, and now they don't have any income. Now you're going to be talking about starvation and true want. So this is the question, right? So remember that the kind of democracy that Locke envisions is liberal democracy. It will only do those things that Locke says it should do: protect you, protect your borders, settle disputes. For social democracy, this is an easy question to solve. Okay, well, if a person falls below a certain level of income, the government helps them out. Well, how are you going to pay for that? Okay, well, we're gonna tax people more heavily. Well, doesn't that go against Smith's idea of a minimally encumbered market? Yes, it does. Some things are more important than capitalism operating more freely. But here's the thing: is that Locke and Smith say no, that the government should not intervene. Now, this is not to say that therefore social democracy, woo, it's great, and liberal democracy, no, it's terrible, right? I mean, liberal democracy does in fact have a solution to this problem. Does anybody know what it is? It's not eugenics, by the way. What does liberal democracy say about caring for the poor? The poor are supposed to be taken care of by charity. And in a society where you have stratification by class, and you've got wealthier people and poorer people, the assumption is that the wealthier people will be able to take care of the poor people. Further, they'll be able to be assisted by their religious organizations, through churches, and larger charitable organizations like that. But it's not the role of the government to do it. Government stays small. And certainly you should not encumber the free operation of the market by imposing larger taxes to take care of poor people. So charity should take care of it. But what if it doesn't? That's where Spencer steps in. So Spencer starts by giving us a sort of broad critique of socialism, generally speaking. When he talks, for instance, in those very first lines about this expediency philosophy of which this general state's superintendence is a practical expression, he's talking about social democracy, basically, about the state stepping in and providing for people when they cannot provide for themselves. So, but almost immediately in this selection, he begins to tell us why that is not right. So about 10 lines from the bottom of that page. As before said, the complete man is the self-sufficing man, the man who is in every point fitted to his circumstances, the man in whom there are desires corresponding not only to all the acts which are immediately advantageous, but to those which are remotely so. Evidently, one who is thus rightly constituted cannot be helped. To do anything for him by some artificial agency is to supersede certain of his powers, is to leave them unexercised and therefore to diminish his happiness. To healthily develop citizens, therefore, state aid is doubly detrimental. So first of all, it would be wrong to provide state aid to people who don't need it. That sort of is the point that he's making here. So, but sort of loaded into that phrase that I just read is the idea that it is singly detrimental to the people who do need it. So he continues in making this point. 675. That long paragraph on 675, it starts with a statement in quotation marks, and this is like Cicero does. This is his response to possible disagreement with him. So he's quoting a supposed socialist. But men are not complete. They are not healthily developed. They have not capacities in harmony with their wants, and therefore, as matters stand, a government does not, by its interpositions, preoccupy offices which there are faculties to fill. Very true, but next to being what we ought to be, the most desirable thing is that we should become what we ought to be as fast as possible. So the objection is, but not everybody can actually take care of themselves. Not everybody is fully healthily developed, and therefore they will require help. And his response to that is, well, yeah, it's true that some people are not optimized, but in a situation where people have not optimized themselves, the goal should be for them to be optimized as soon as possible. We are undergoing the process of adaptation. We have to lose the characteristics which fitted us for our original state and to gain those which will fit us for our present state. And the question to be asked respecting these mechanical remedies for our deficiencies is, do they facilitate the change? Certainly not. A moment's thought will convince us that they retard it, they slow it. No one can need reminding that supply and demand and supply is the law of life as well as the law of trade. The strength will show itself only where strength is called for. That an underdeveloped capacity can be developed only under stern discipline of necessity. So he says a few things here. The first thing he says is that you need to consider this like any other part of evolution. The poor are at the bottom because they are bad at competing with people that are better equipped in a capitalist society than they are, intellectually. And therefore, that they are at the bottom is not an unfortunate consequence of capitalism. It is the natural result of people who are unequipped to live within capitalism to cope with it. Would you draw out and increase some too feeble sentiment, then you must set it to do as well as it can the work required of it. It must be kept ever active, ever strained, ever inconvenienced by its incompetency. Under this treatment, it will, in the slow lapse of generations, attain to efficiency, and what was once its impossible task will become the source of a healthy, pleasurable, and desired excitement. So if there are people at the bottom, he says, look at it like somebody who you don't think is smart. If you got somebody who you think is ignorant, one way to deal with that problem is to educate that person. And over time, if they've got the bare minimum of potential needed to be educated, they will seem smarter because they've learned things. And they'll elevate. But at the same time, there's also some people that can't be educated for whatever reason, for their intellectual feebleness. And those people they'll stay at the bottom. The same thing, he says, goes for those people that are economically at the bottom. Challenging them in those situations is actually the best thing you can do for them. Because it's in those moments of hardship that they will find their ability to compete at their highest level and rise out of it by their own action. But if they don't, it's because they can't. But let a state instrumentality be thrust between such faculty and its work, and the process of adaptation is at once suspended. Growth ceases, and in its place commences retrogression. The embryo agency, now superseded by some commission, some board, and staff of officers, straightway dwindles. So, and if, he says, government gets in the way of that, then you do a disservice to that person who would not otherwise maximize their potential by being so challenged by the society in which they find themselves. So his solution to the problem of poverty is to say that the people who are poor are there because they either can't or won't compete at their highest level. If they won't, well, you can't make them. But if they can't, and this is sort of where things get a little bit ugly, then it's really just a matter of accepting that and leaving them poor. So this falls back again now onto the issue of charity. Okay, well, if they're poor, then charity should take care of it. And this is when he then begins to address this particular issue. Bottom of page 678. Returning again to the highest point of view, we find that there is a second and still more injurious mode in which law-enforced charity checks the whole process of adaptation. To become fit for the social state, man has not only to lose his savageness, but he has to acquire capacities needful for civilized life. Power of application must be developed, such modification of the intellect as shall qualify for new tasks must take place. And above all, there must be gained the ability to sacrifice a small immediate gratification for a great future great one. He says a little further into that paragraph, the process must be undergone and sufferings must be endured. So no state bailout for for people that are suffering under bad economic conditions. At the bottom of 679, he pushes it further. At first sight, these considerations seem conclusive against all relief to the poor, voluntary as well as compulsory. And it is no doubt true, because think about it this way. If you are doing a disservice to the person, him or herself, by aiding them when they are poor, then it makes no more sense to help them by charity than it does to help them by a government program. In either case, you are not giving them the challenge that could possibly have them rise above their condition. And so to give charity is on the same level as to provide for social welfare. With this condemnation, however, no rational man will quarrel that careless squandering of pence which has fostered into perfection a system of organized begging, which has made skillful mendicancy more profitable than ordinary manual labor, which induces the stimulation of palsy, epilepsy, cholera, and no end of diseases and deformities, which has called into existence warehouses for the sale and hire of impostors' dresses, which has given to pity-inspiring babes a market value of 9 pence per day. The unthinking benevolence which has generated all this cannot but be disapproved by everyone. So not only no social programs, no social welfare, but no charity for the poor either. Now he says, you know, look, this may seem cruel, he says. But he says, imagine how cruel it would be if we didn't do this. First of all, it would be, again, a disservice to the people who actually can rise above their station by being placed in adverse conditions and finding that they can rise above it. For those people that can't, he says, you leave them at the bottom. What's the logical conclusion, by the way, of what happens if you don't feed poor people? Yeah.
They starve.
They starve. They die. Right? Now he says, is going to seem particularly cruel to you. But think about how much crueler it would be if you didn't starve them. Because if you don't starve them, he says, or allow them to starve, I should say, then what you do is you almost certainly guarantee that they're going to have children of their own. And because he sees all of this as being a matter of biology and not a matter of environment or economics or politics or any of these other things, he says it's almost a foregone guarantee that their children will be as poorly equipped as they are. And then you're just going to have a larger number of people within your society who are going to require your assistance. So better that you allow a small number to die today than you don't allow them to die, take care of them, and find 10 years, 20 years, 50 years down the line that you've got an exponentially larger number of them that now you have to find some solution for. Now he never comes out and says it quite so bluntly, but it's the only conclusion that can be drawn from what he's saying. Because it's not even a matter of him wanting to consider the possibility of a society in which charity can't take care of the poor. He literally goes as far as to say that charity ought not take care of the poor, for all the reasons already pointed out. So if you are against charity, which is the one thing that a liberal democracy and a limited government and a broadly capitalistic economy will allow for, to care for those people that for whatever reason have become poor, then you're leaving no other solution to the issue, to the problem. The other thing that can happen, other than obviously the people just dying, is crime. I mean, people get desperate when they get hungry, and they will steal to feed themselves, and particularly to feed their children. And the solution then is prisons. So there's one of two ways that the person who falls upon hard times for whatever reason can pursue. According to Spencer, it can be starving to death, or stealing food, getting caught, and going to prison. Where at least, I guess, the argument could be made that you could be pressed into some labor that would be useful to society. But at least, in a liberal society, there's not the idea that you just impress people into labor for no reason whatsoever. That would be violating their rights. But of course, if they break the law, then their rights become significantly diluted. Now, here is the thing to consider about Spencer's formulations for this. He's not even talking about people that are not English. So his way of looking at this is entirely one that is stratified on the basis of class. It doesn't even begin to take into account, never mind people that aren't white, people that aren't English. So what the Scottish do is a different thing. What the Irish certainly do is a different thing, because if you know anything about British class prejudice, it is very strongly correlated with the extent to which one is Irish rather than English, and that's mainly a colonial extension than anything else. But once this gets applied on the level of ethnicity, and then more broadly on the level of race, imagine what the implications are for that. And this is where Pearson comes into the picture. So Pearson is from the generation after Spencer, but is very much influenced by social Darwinism, except that by the time Pearson is beginning to put these ideas together, colonialism has reached its maximum expression, particularly in Africa. Right? This is the race for Africa that takes place in the 1880s, where what has not yet been colonized in Africa is divided among the colonial powers in Europe, and only Ethiopia is left independent at that point. Right, so every country in Western Europe gets its colonies. England has the largest number. France has the second largest number, but the Netherlands has them. Belgium has them. Spain and Portugal have them. And as has already happened in the Americas, there is, first of all, significant die-offs of populations by being exposed to disease that they've never been exposed to. The slave trade has already been going on for 300 years at this point, so all of the cruelties that are inherent in that have gone on as well. And there's just the plain conflict of people who live in these places not wanting other people coming in and taking their resources, which is, a natural human reaction. So the main thing about Pearson is that he's actually really famous outside of this whole area of social Darwinism. Because have any of you taken biostatistics yet? You're what? You're taking it now, so did you learn Pearson's R squared? No, you didn't do the chi-square test with finding p-values? You're 2 months in, and you haven't talked about Pearson at all.
Every class.
Unbelievable. Yeah, so Pearson is a major figure in statistics. He devised some of the statistical tests that are used in a broad number of fields, but very, very widely used in biostats. The chi-square test and Pearson's correlation coefficient and all that stuff is all from this guy. And then around the turn of the century, he began lecturing on the topic of race. And it's this selection we have on page 681 of your book that gives a really sort of good overview of what he believes about race, particularly with regard to the struggles that Europeans have had with non-European races up until this point, and then the current ongoing battle with the peoples of sub-Saharan Africa. So he says, 681, what I have said about bad stock seems to me to hold for the lower races of man. How many centuries, how many thousands of years have the Kafir, a tribe in southern Africa, or the Negro held large districts in Africa undisturbed by the white man? Kafir, by the way, is a word that comes from Arabic, which means non-believer, but it's like a word that in South Africa in particular has a like a real balance of like the N-word basically here. It's like that level of a racial slur. Yet their intertribal struggles have not yet produced a civilization in the least comparable with the Aryan. You got? Have a seat. Thank you. The Aryan, and it says there in brackets, Western European. Right? And notably, he uses the term that 20 years later the Nazis will be using. So the Nazis didn't invent this term. It's something that was had begun to be circulated around this time. The genealogy of the term is a little strange. For one thing, the people that were up until the 20th century identified as Aryan were the people of North India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran, who speak Aryan languages as they're currently classified. But around the turn of the last century, this became the word to identify the Northern Europeans, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, tall people of Northern Europe. So they have not, in their intertribal struggles, have not produced a civilization in the least comparable with the Aryan. Educate and nurture them as you will, I do not believe you will succeed in modifying the stock. History shows me one way, and one way only, in which the high state of civilization has been produced, namely the struggle of race with race and the survival of the physically and mentally fitter race. So he makes it quite clear in that first paragraph that he believes in the racial superiority of white people. And as if proof were needed of that, he then offers us the situation in colonial endeavors thus far. Let us suppose we could prevent the white man, if we liked, from going to lands of which the agricultural and mineral resources are not worked to the full. Then I should say 1,000 times better for him that he should not go, than he should settle down and live alongside the inferior race. The only healthy alternative is that he should go and completely drive out the inferior race. That is practically what the white man has done in North America. But I venture to say that no man calmly judging will wish either that the whites had never gone to America, or would desire that whites and red Indians were today living together alongside each other as Negro and white in the southern states, as Kafir and European in South Africa, still less that they had mixed their blood as Spaniard and Indian in South America. So, to distill this briefly, it's better that the races not mix it. It's better that the races not come into contact, that they mix. And further, that whites shouldn't go to other continents and conquer these places unless they're prepared to undergo a struggle. But what history has shown is that they always win, and that for him proves their superiority, that they always win. And he says the worst possible situation that can happen, by the way, is what happened in South America, where instead of just killing all the Indians, they actually settled down and married with the ones that managed to survive. Because now what you have is you have an entire continent full of people that are of questionable racial identity. And that it would have been far better that they either exterminate them fully or consign them to segregation like the whites have done with the black population in the southern United States. By the way, when Hitler writes Mein Kampf 25 years later, he will literally say the same thing, almost word for word. So it's not that this is, it's not that the Nazis come up with their ideas about race out of whole cloth. These are widely circulated ideas about not only the idea of different levels of superiority among races, but that the larger crime resides in the dilution of white people with non-white races. I venture to assert then that the struggle for existence between the white and red man, painful and even terrible as it was in its details, has given us good far outbalancing its immediate evil. In place of the red man contributing practically nothing to the work and thought of the world. We have a great nation, mistress of many arts, and able with its youthful imagination and fresh, untrammeled impulses to contribute much to the common stock of civilized man. But America is but one case in which we have to mark a masterful human progress following an interracial struggle. Here he comes to the example of Australia. But then he, sort of lays out the stages as well. So for Pearson, it goes beyond class, and it is very clearly a struggle between races. But the same belief underlies it, which is that it's only through struggle that human beings are perfected. And this is why they call it social Darwinism, by the way, because, remember that Darwin says that speciation is a result of resource scarcity. And your ability to adapt demonstrates your fitness for survival. So if you apply that correlation to struggles between human societies, you are going to draw the conclusions that he does. It's like there's an expression it's like a person who has hammers for hands. If you only have hammers for hands, everything's going to look like a nail to you. If you look at the world with a worldview like this one, then the outcomes are going to just reinforce the beliefs that you brought to the situation to begin with. And if you lose, because every once in a while the Europeans lose in these things, then you're going to see it as a fluke rather than as the possibility that your ideas are wrong. So middle of page 682, the great function of science in national life is to show us what national life means and how the nation is a vast organism subject to the great forces of evolution. So this, by the way, echoes fascism very closely by identifying the nation as a sort of organically constituted body. Right? The ethnic nationalist believes that ethnicity is something that is palpably true rather than something that is also constructed. And the fascist in particular then elevates nation above individual. There's a struggle of race against race and of nation against nation. In the early days of that struggle, it was a blind, unconscious struggle of barbaric tribes. At the present day, in the case of the civilized white man, it has become more and more the conscious, carefully directed attempt of the nation to fit itself to a continuously changing environment. The nation has to foresee how and where the struggle will be carried on. The maintenance of national position is becoming more and more a conscious preparation for changing conditions and an insight into the needs of coming environments. If a nation is to maintain its position in this struggle, it must be fully provided with trained brains in every department of national activity, from the government to the factory, and have, if possible, a reserve of brain and physique to fall back upon in times of national crisis. So he takes these ideas about race and these ideas about nationalism and nation and the importance of nation, its organic nature, and its need to be elevated above the individual. Then he says what we really need is government to then support these things, which makes it really sort of explicitly fascist, although fascism is not even a thing at this point. Because when he talks about having this reserve of brain and physique to fall back on in times of national crisis, he then says, the government therefore needs to incentivize eugenics programs. And that can only be achieved through some kind of government planning, through some kind of strong government. So for Pearson, and I want to be clear about this, Pearson is not typical of most racists in this regard, nor is he typical, for that matter, of most colonialists or even typical of most fascists in being racist himself. But he actually sort of veers widely off of the point of Enlightenment thinking here, which is probably not surprising given that he's so abundantly racist and therefore can't possibly believe in things like the innate equality of all human beings, because clearly he does not. But he also sort of divorces himself very clearly from these things like small government that Locke says are necessary and that are the best consequences of Enlightenment thinking. you will see that my view, and I think it can be called the scientific view of a nation, is that the organized whole kept up to a high pitch of internal efficiency by ensuring that its numbers are substantially recruited from the better stocks and kept to a high pitch of external efficiency by conquest, chiefly by way of war with inferior races and with equal races by the struggle for trade routes and the sources of raw material and of food supply. This is the natural history of mankind, and I do not think you can, in its main features, subvert it. So colonialism is not just something that causes this conflict to happen, but something that should actually be actively sought, because it has that effect of submitting the people to adversity, which as Spencer says himself, is good, right? Because it's for those people that can face the adversity, they come out better. And so therefore, it's just a matter of just finding more places to colonize. And if you can't do that, then have a war someplace. Again, this is something that that you see actually stated explicitly by Hitler in Mein Kampf 2. The idea that war is a good thing because it's a purifying force. It submits men to adversity, and in doing so, it allows only the best to survive. And in that way, you improve the quality. You improve the quality of your race even more and more. By extension, by the way, he says that you go to war with people of your own race if you need to, because in that way you'll get that adversity through physical conflict that all people need. Is it not a fact that the daily bread of our millions of workers depends on having somebody to work for? That if we give up the contest for trade routes and for free markets and for wastelands, we indirectly give up our food supply? Is it not a fact that our strength depends on these and upon our colonies, and that our colonies have been won by the ejection of inferior races and are maintained against equal races only by respect for the present power of our empire? In the last paragraph on that page, he says, the path of progress is strewn with the wrecks of nations. Traces are everywhere to be seen of the hecatombs, the slaughtered remains of inferior races and of victims who have found not the narrow way to perfection. Yet these dead people are in very truth the stepping stones on which mankind has arisen to the higher intellectual and deeper emotional life of today. So it's a very clear enunciation of a racist worldview. So what is maybe more disturbing about it than just the sort of the very plain enunciation of it is just that it wasn't a particularly stunning thing to say in 1901 when he said it. It was broadly believed by a lot of people. Certainly what he says about non-whites was signed on to by the vast majority of people within his social class. And probably, broadly speaking, there was a general agreement that the mixing of races was wrong, even if you didn't have any concrete understanding of, as a working class or middle class English person, any real sense of the way that people lived on other continents or in other cultures. There was a sense that you were a member of your group, and that might be better or worse, but you were better off sticking with your own kind. What probably somebody like Pearson doesn't imagine comes out of this line of thinking is that this will have the maybe unintended consequence of causing this conflict once the sort of the whole colonial endeavor, at least outside of Europe, is over, to giving rise to a continued colonial endeavor within Europe itself. Because once you've stratified the races and you have exterminated the ones with whom you can't live or who can't, from your standpoint, survive, and moreover you have subjugated the ones who, for whatever reason, you've allowed to survive, and every inch of territory on the whole globe is actively ruled by some colonial power or by some native population that is at least by extraction from a colonial power, then what comes next? Then you will stratify the nations within Europe amongst themselves. And when you do that, then, because this is not something that he himself does, but that will shortly come this way, shortly will come down the road. When Germany is sort of coming into its continental-wide position, it acquires some colonies in Africa, but not a lot of them, because most of them have already been taken. So it gets what's now the Cameroon, it gets what's now Tanzania, but the big ones, the ones that have the most abundant wealth, those ones have been taken by the British and the French and the Belgians. And so Germany wants to acquire colonies, because that's what makes a great country in the 19th century. It's not sufficient to be a great country to be militarily strong, or to have a high-ranking economic position, which Germany has both. What's necessary is to colonize the lesser peoples. That's really sort of the big goal, because only once you've done that, like the British and the French have done in particular, can you really say that you are you're a world power and not just a continental power. And even Russia, has an empire as well. It's Russia, and the ruling class are Russian-speaking, but it has all this territory here that's populated by non-Russians. Here's Finland, here's Ukraine, here's the Baltic states, parts of Romania. So it rules over a large territory of non-Russians, and then the Turks do as well, and the Austrians. But Germany doesn't have an empire. And the problem for Germany in acquiring its empire, other than the comparatively inferior colonies that it manages to argue for and get in Africa, is that where's it going to take colonies from? Well, it can't get colonies to the north, because Germans see these people in the north as kindred people. These are Scandinavians. These are the big-boned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, tall people that the Germans believe that they are, and in fact are, very closely related to. So to aggress against those people would be wrong. Even during World War II, when Germany invaded those countries, it actually let Denmark keep its own government for the whole war. And Norway it occupied, but only because it felt like it had to. So it didn't occupy Sweden at all. So it can't go north. And it can't go south because the Alps are there, and you really sort of can't get over them. And on top of it, to the south is Austria and Switzerland, and they're German people too. You're not going to take colonies there. And you can't go west because France has the strongest army on the continent. And so the only place that you can go is east. And that has a couple good things going for it. First of all, while Russia's big,